Good afternoon, and welcome to Humanities Montana's virtual panel on the political power of young people. My name is Randy Tanglin, and I'm the Executive Director of Humanities Montana. And this is the last in a series of 4 virtual panels for our Why It Matters initiative on civic and electoral participation. Now, Humanities Montana is, of course, a nonpartisan organization. But in our conversations with Montanans from all around the state, we at Humanities Montana have found that there's just a real hunger for the context and diverse viewpoints that the humanities can bring to the most pressing issues of our day. We also hear Montanans expressing a desire for a healthy, respectful, and civil discourse around these conversations, and we believe this is possible. And today we bring you 4 different voices of experience and expertise to explore the nuances of why and how young people in Montana engage the political process. I want to thank our 4 wonderful panelists in advance. You'll be introduced to them very soon. I want to thank you for the insight that you'll offer us today. And I want to thank our wonderful moderator, Amy Martin, as well. And I thank all of you in the audience for being part of Humanities Montana's Why It Matters initiative. Our program officer, Samantha Dwyer, will now tell you what to expect from the Zoom panel and introduce our panelists.
This afternoon's program is going to be an opportunity to hear from some of those up and coming generations and the younger generation and how they have political power and how they kind of flex that and how they engage with our democracy and with our communities. So the conversation is with Samantha Francoise, Kirsten Yee, Tahin Perez, and Taylor Wilmarth, and moderated by Amy Martin. Samantha is a Whitefish native with a love for the Flathead Valley. She's a social justice activist and a public speaker who has a passion to see real change in her community and the world. After a recent photo of Samantha standing up to an angry white man during a Black Lives Matter rally went viral, that passion turned to purpose. Finding strength to look hate in the eyes was the catalyst to begin the work in Montana. Kirsten worked as a campaigner with Stand Earth and an organizing representative with the Sierra Club. She earned her master's degree in public administration from Montana State University. Kirsten is now the executive director of Forward Montana, a statewide organization that builds the political power of young people. Tahin works as the deputy director for Western Native Voice. His work inspires Indigenous leadership across Montana, both in tribal nations and urban areas. Tahin grew up in Wyoming, is a first-generation American and a first-generation college graduate. He has a BA in history from Austin College in Sherman, Texas. Tahin previously served on the City of Billings Human Relations Commission and ran for Billings City Council in 2017. Taylor is a senior at C.M. Russell High School in Great Falls, Montana, where he is an editor for the school's newspaper, The Stampede. He serves as chair of the local Montana Youth Action Chapter and recently completed a high school fellowship with Forward Montana Foundation. Our moderator for the conversation for these 4 panelists is Amy Martin. Amy is a journalist and the host of Threshold, a public radio show and podcast that investigates pressing environmental issues in depth. We are grateful for her thoughtful moderation of these panels, and I'm so happy to turn it over to her now to guide this conversation.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks everyone for being here, and especially to our panelists for being here. It's a little bittersweet. This is our last of these 4 convenings, and it's really been an honor to have been in the moderator chair. So thank you so much, Humanities Montana, for asking me to be part of this. And I think there are a lot of people who have come to all 4, so kudos to you. And if you haven't, if this is your first one, that's totally great too. It's not a serialized thing. You don't have to know what happened in the first 3 to get a lot out of this one. So I just want to start by saying we had a preliminary conversation, the panelists and Humanities Montana staff and me, and we were talking about, well, this is the political power of young people. So what's young? And I'm really happy to find out that 35 and under is young, apparently. That's what we are deciding I am not 35 and younger, but I'm a lot closer to that than what I thought young had to be. So good news, young is getting older. um, and you might know, if you have been part of these in the past, that we like to throw out a few questions for the audience to respond to in the chat. I'll go ahead and throw one out now that we're going to actually revisit with the panelists in just a little bit, just to kind of get you thinking. So feel free to answer in the chat or just think about it internally if you'd rather do that. And it's a simple question of, what is the first event of national political significance that you remember? What is the thing that you remember becoming aware of, concerned about, excited and happy about? It doesn't have to be a disaster or a tragedy. It can be something good. Yeah, we'd love to know how that defined you. So let's get to our panelists. All four of you are invited to be on this panel because you're politically active in some way or in more than one way. That could mean running for office, but it obviously isn't only that. You're all engaged citizens in one way or another. And I feel like just to give the rest of us a chance to kind of get oriented into who you are and what the possibilities for our conversation might be, can you each tell us just a brief overview of your pathway into political life? And Kirsten, I'm going to pick on you. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Humanities Montana, and everyone for having me here. I'm Kirsten Yee, I use she, her pronouns, and like Samantha mentioned, I'm the executive director at Ford Montana. So I consider myself a lot of things. I'm a facilitator, an advocate, an organizer, and a relationship builder. I'm a fifth generation Asian American woman who fell in love with the mountains, climbing and skiing. I come from parents who love to travel and to camp. I come from the beach with consistent temperatures hovering around 70 degrees. And now I come from the mountains with really variable temperatures and seasons that pretty much change every day or every minute. And my people are passionate rabble rousers who use terms like intersectionality at least 10 times a day. My people are a fun-loving bunch who stay up way too late and judge the hashtag van life while simultaneously craving that. I say all of that to say that's who I am and sort of the like personality and approach that I bring to my organizing and political involvement. I've spent the first part of my career in conservation and climate organizing, conducted my master's research on multicultural organizational development, and have also served survivors of domestic violence. I grew up in San Diego, California, and as I look back at my childhood, I feel really grateful for the opportunities my parents gave me. So for example, imagine me as a little baby, I'm probably about 4 or 6 months, got the same smile, this massive head of hair that sticks out everywhere. And it's during this time that my parents first took me camping. It was either to Yosemite or the Santa Cruz Mountains. They don't exactly remember, but they really instilled that environmental ethic and caring for the land and being outside early on. As my dad puts it, my entry into their life wasn't going to slow them down, wasn't going to stop anything. Instead, I, as a baby, was going to adapt to their lifestyle. So like I said, this upbringing really just instilled a strong environmental ethic in me and laid the foundations of who I wanted to be and where I wanted to go. I knew that I wanted to make a difference, but didn't really know what that meant. And it wasn't until college that I truly realized that the power of people and what citizen involvement meant. I had just thought you had to be a lawyer or a scientist to affect change and have a fancy degree. And for me, it was actually Occupy Wall Street when I was in college that really sort of turned that on its head for me. And like, wow, like all of us coming together has a huge impact. And afterwards, I learned about this job and this world of organizing, and that really encompassed all that I love to do and wanted to do, and a really good skill set for my personality. And so that's just a little bit of my entryway into this work.
Fascinating. What a great synopsis. Who wants to go next?
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Taylor Wilmarth. I'm a senior in high school. It's great to see everybody. And I just want to say thank you to Humanities Montana for providing me the opportunity to come today. And it's also nice to see a lot of faces in the audience that I recognize. So good to see all of you. I think my intro to kind of the political world comes from my parents. I have very politically literate parents who are involved. My dad works at City Hall. And so I've kind of had a natural exposure to this realm already. I recently became the chair of Montana Youth Action, which is a bipartisan youth organization with the purpose of promoting education about politics to young people in high school, because we don't feel that we necessarily get the amount of education we need in school all the time. And so that's kind of something I got started here in Great Falls, and I've met a lot of phenomenal people across the state in that work. I'm excited to go to college next year. I'm going to the University of Montana to study journalism, and so I'm very excited for that. Are we getting yet to the event that we remember first, or is that later?
That's later.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
But good to see everybody.
Thank you, Taylor. Samantha, do you want to take the mic next?
Sure. I'm Samantha Francoise. I'm a Whitefish, Montana native. My kind of entry into this world, and politically speaking, actually started last June, really. Growing up in Montana and being African American, I kind of struggled to use my voice. I've always been educated. I've always liked to keep myself educated, but when it came to speaking out, it was something I was very uncomfortable with. I always felt like if I spoke, or gave my opinion, I was the angry Black girl or things like that. But then last summer, during a BLM rally in Whitefish, a man got in my face, and a young gal caught it on a photo of it, and it spread like wildfire. And it was the first time that I really had the opportunity to step up and use my voice. I didn't have to, but it was very gratifying. And since then, I have spoke all over the world through Zoom, of course, just kind of sharing my story and my heart, and why it's so important to be active in your community, and for the BIPOC community specifically, to kind of give them a platform so that even though we're small here, we're here and we're welcome. And doing the work here has been so empowering for me, and to share my story and to speak out for the BIPOC community, and to continue to do that is my passion and purpose in life.
Wonderful, thank you. I just want to take a quick minute just to highlight something for folks who may have seen the picture of Samantha with this angry man leaning over her, and you're meeting his gaze very determinedly. One of the things that I found so powerful about that, as I found out a little bit more, was not just the event itself, but kind of how you handled it, how you responded to that man's family after the fact. And just while we're on this little part of your bio, would you mind just sharing a little bit about that so that everybody has more context? I think maybe a lot of people saw the picture and nothing else. So
sure, yeah. So like I said, it was just during a rally, and that happened, and it was a moment. It wasn't this long drawn out thing. It was captured beautifully by a teenage girl that I'm very close to. And after that, though, like I said, I had a choice to make. I could have been mad or scared or hurt by this man, but instead I felt bad for him, the ignorance and fear that he felt towards what we were doing when it was such a peaceful, beautiful thing that we were doing. So in the days coming, I received a lot of love and a lot of hate online, and so did he, and so did his wife. We found that out later, that people were kind of attacking her as well, and that rubbed me the wrong way. Specifically, she's not her husband, and her kids, they're separate entities. So a friend of mine and I decided to just make her a little gift basket, just girly stuff, bath stuff, wine, just plants, just to let her know that we didn't see her that way. And we didn't do it to be showy. And I'm so glad that people caught that part of the story, because that's even more beautiful for me. Women standing together and coming together, against hate and, violence and all of that. And so we ended up, through a friend of a friend, found out where she worked, brought it to her in a public place, and we're able to kind of exchange some I care for yous. And since then we've chatted a few times, checked in on her and she's checked on me. And it was a really powerful experience, and it made what I went through and kind of everything that led up to that moment even more purposeful and powerful. Because you see those moments, you see the picture or the video, but you don't know what's happening behind the scenes. And even with the hate that I got, it was ignorant hate, and for her to have to receive any of that, it just really made me feel sick. So it was really cool to reach out and do, can kind of keep extending that that peaceful power of mind. So.
Well, I think you deserve a lot of credit for taking a scary and upsetting moment and turning it into like an example of how to love. Tahin, we haven't heard from you. Tell us about your story.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tahin Perez. I am Tujunacu indigenous from Mexico. I am the Deputy Director for Western Native Voice, and Western Native Voice is a nonpartisan 501c3 organization that does civic engagement, public policy advocacy, and leadership development work in Montana's tribal nations as well as urban areas, and we are expanding to Idaho currently as well. And much like Dr. Tanglin, involved with Austin College. So I graduated, my alma mater is where she taught for 12 years. And so it's great to see you again, Dr. Tanglin. And I guess my experience with politics, with body politic and with electoral work stems from the intersection of a lot of different I guess you call them movements or ideologies into my life. So I primarily introduced myself as indigenous, even though my parents come from Mexico. And so there's a lot of people would consider me Mexican or American or Mexican American. So there's the different layers of identity there. Identity has always been an important part of who I am. And in a lot of ways, I talk about how my existence is political. My sheer existence as a person of color is political, and that I don't have any other option but to be involved in politics because it's ingrained in who I am. My father was involved in political organizing when he was in Mexico, and I have, as a first generation American and as somebody who has seen firsthand lived through things such as immigration policy, that I see how those things aren't just concepts, that aren't just talking points or pieces of debate. Those are things that are ingrained in people's lives. And so I've lived my entire life knowing that politics and being involved in especially electoral work been incredibly important. I saw my parents work and earn their citizenship and become naturalized. I, of course, have the privilege of being naturally born citizen in the United States and having rights and responsibilities that come with that. And knowing that for many years, my parents were not in that same sort of security. And so I take my responsibility, my civic responsibility very, very, very seriously. It is, as soon as I was able to vote, I got out and voted, and it aligns with the work that I do now with Western Native Voice in working not only with Native folks in the state, but also non-Native folks, basically anybody who is looking to get involved in their community and get involved civically, specifically. So that's my story in a short form, and I appreciate you all for your attention, and I thank you to Humanities Montana for making this possible.
Thanks, Tahin. What a rock star panel. It's just, if we just ended right there, I feel like we've all learned things. So, but we're not going to end. We're going to dive in now. I saw a few things come up on the chat in relation to this question of shaping force and or shaping event of your youth, maybe. I think that it is something that really ends up defining what a generation even is. If it's like, oh, I was in junior high when this and that happened, and so just really quick, I'd love to hear from the panelists. What's the first event of national political significance that you really remember being aware of?
Well, for me, the first one, I was in third grade when 9/11 happened, and I was about 9, I would say, and I will just never forget seeing the footage on the news over and over and over again, and hearing how my dad reacted to it, and then hearing how what was being talked about at school and then what was being talked about at church. I remember it being significant and not quite understanding why, you know, and in days to come, kind of learning about it at such a basic level for a 9-year-old, I just knew it was going to be life-changing.
Yeah.
Mine is very similar, 9/11, except I don't exactly remember the actual event itself or like seeing it on the news, but what I remember is about all of the conversations and protests afterwards about war and weapons of mass destruction and some of the political fallout around President Bush.
Mhm.
This is Tahin. For me, the very first political moment that I remember is the 2000 election, where Gore and Bush sort of squared off. I was 10, and I remember election night, and I think I remember it specifically because it was the first election that my parents were eligible to vote, and so they had talked about how they cast their ballot for Al Gore, and so we sort of all watched the results come in, and that was the first sort of election night coverage that I remember seeing. Um, and and so that would be the first one, the first significant one where I was cognizant of the impact, because for the 2000 election, I saw it, I felt like it was a steal on Bush's behalf, that he stole the election. But it wasn't until a similar response to Samantha and Kirsten here, but when September 11th happened a year later, or less than a year later, that was one of the first moments where I recognized that this was a turning point in American history, that there was no going back to a life before that, and that everything had changed. And as I was watching it in my 6th grade class, we went to the library to watch it on TV live, and just the quiet in the room, about asking how we were feeling and everything, and all I can remember is, this is huge, this is really important, and it's going to shape the rest of.
Yeah.
It's interesting that all three of the other panelists mentioned 9/11, because I was actually born in 2002, and so I have no recollection of 9/11, and so I think that kind of changes anyone who's around my age's perspective on the world, really. And I think the main issue that comes to mind of political significance in terms of tragedy are the school shootings that occur again and again. That's the main thing that comes to my mind in terms of tragedy. The first event, however, of political significance that I remember is the 2008 election. I just remember that it was a record-setting election when Barack Obama was the first Black president, and there was record-setting voter turnout. And like I said earlier, my parents are both very politically literate, and so I learned a lot. And then in the years following that election, I kind of came to realize that not everybody views politics in the same way. And so throughout elementary school, we would have our debates, which probably were more based on our parents' beliefs, but certainly they shape who we become later in life. And so, but yeah, I think that was probably the time when I first got interested in politics.
Yeah, well, thank you all for sharing that. And just, glancing at the chat, I'm seeing things, the JFK assassination, the Nixon resignation. I think my friend Ethel may even have we've got an FDR reference in there. Hi, Ethel. And I think it's to me, it feels like one of these important things when we're talking about politics and civic engagement is just to really understand the different entry points that we all have, and that it's something that I've had to contend with when I used to do some work with kids, and realizing, I remember when we were working on a Martin Luther King celebration event, and I asked any of the kids if they wanted to explain who Martin Luther King was, and a very smart and capable young lady stood up and said, well, do you all know, like way back, there used to be this like 19 something something something. And I was like, oh, right. Like from here on out, everybody else's reference is going to be like the 1900s is like how I think of the 1800s. And I was born in the 1900s. And just really wrapping our heads in all directions around what it means if you came of age, like realizing like, watching the loss of JFK versus watching 9/11 versus watching Barack Obama. It's an interesting way to, I think, to start to empathize with each other a little bit. So getting into Montana specifically, I learned in preparation for this panel that Montana has the oldest median age of any of the 10 states that are in the continental Western US. So that's interesting, but it's also really interesting in our huge state in terms of space, how much it varies county by county. So this is quoting from the Montana Free Press. Missoula and Bozeman are home to a disproportionate share of 20-something residents by national standards. So those two, Missoula County, Gallatin County, have 19 and 21% of their populations respectively are 20, I think it was 21 and younger or something. No, 25 and younger, compared to 14% nationally. So those two counties actually have higher proportions of young people. But rural counties in Montana have huge demographic gaps. In Granite County, which includes Phillipsburg, 21% of the residents are in their 60s, which is nearly twice the national figure of 11%. So rather than starting with thinking about Montana as an older state in general, I'm really curious to hear how our panelists think about how these differences within our state are shaping our politics. The fact that there are these places that are actually trending younger than the national average, and then other places where we're trending significantly older, and yet we're all trying to share kind of one, well, we have one legislature for one thing. So how do you see that affecting us as Montanans?
I can start on this. So I think it plays a huge difference. And just to drill down some of those numbers even more, when you look at the city of Bozeman, it's like people in their 20s, so it's like 20 to 29, make up 33% of the population. And Bozeman actually has 70% of Bozeman residents are under 40. Like, that's really young. Amy, your face is so great. Yeah, this is from the most recent American Community Survey data. I'm so excited for the census to come out to like fully dig into that. But Bozeman's really young. And I think we've seen a lot of what that means, and just politically, how the shifting demographics of Gallatin County has really shifted the makeup of the county commission, the city commission, and state reps and state senators from the county and who's being represented. So I think it plays a huge role. If any of you are like really interested in the numbers, at Tufts University, there's a center called Circle. That's the Center for Information on Civic Learning and Engagement. And they specifically focus on youth voter turnout across the country. And what they found in 2020 is that young people, so I think they define that as voters under 30, overwhelmingly favored President Biden in the 2020 election. But when you break it down by race, the story is a lot different. Young white voters were a lot more split between President Biden and President Trump, whereas Latinx, Black, and Asian voters were overwhelmingly supporting President Biden. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough data on young Native voters for them to be able to parse out that data even more. But Montana, as we know, is very different. We have a very significant white youth population. We also have a really significant Native population that Tahin can speak a little bit more to about those numbers. And we've seen that young people and the Native vote has really been a key player in how our statewide elections goes, and we're pretty pivotal in like the election of Senator Tester, Governor Bullock, Democrats who win, and when the state tends to vote Republican during the presidential election. So really interesting dynamics there, and I think we're seeing those large culture shifts happen at the local level. So City of Bozeman, like I said, 70% of residents are under 40. Just appointed last night Christopher Coburn into the commission spot, who is a young gay Black man, super excited, really amazing public health and community leader. So I think we're seeing the effects of what those demographic shifts mean.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing all that those numbers I did have a total jaw drop. I can't believe that 70% of the population is under 40. Tahin, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, thank you, Kirsten, for the shout out of the native vote. It is something that we talk about a lot, that I personally talk about, an organization talks about, is how pivotal. And so I know that we're talking about sort of youth, younger people, but it's also important to take stock of the racial demographics of Montana and how that, and just talking a little bit more, doubling down on what Kirsten said about how the research shows that white voters are, especially young voters, are sort of more split in their support for Trump versus Biden, and that the opposite is true for people of color. People of color are more cognizant of the microaggressions and the sort of the structural racism that is embodied in political speech, and particularly how certain buzzwords are used and dog whistles. And so it's important to, while we're having a conversation about how shifting demographics of age are important, it's also important to note the shifting demographics of race, as well as socioeconomic status, and how that plays a part. But as far as the native vote, there is a significant increase in young voters. I think that historically, most of the voters have been sort of older people who have, established families and have the means to be able to get registered to vote and to actually cast a ballot. And so, but our work at Western Native Voice is aiming to diversify the electorate in Indian country to have those kinds of messages be more prevalent in schools, even younger than voting age populations. So starting as young as elementary and middle school, to really talk about the importance of civic engagement and sort of building up from some of the basic foundations of civic engagement, so that by the time it does come to registering them to vote, it's sort of a no-brainer for them. And our overall goal is to make voting more of a tradition in tribal areas and with Native communities and families. So just wanted to add on to that.
Great. Well, and Taylor, you are a young Montanan who doesn't live in Missoula or Bozeman. How's life for you? And what do you think about in terms of, I know you're going to head over to Missoula for college, but what if you're a young Montanan who doesn't want to settle in Missoula or Bozeman area, but you do want to be in Montana? Do you think it's a challenge to sort of find community and find sort of like youth culture in a place like Great Falls, for instance?
I think it certainly can be. I think that's an issue that's on the minds of a lot of local leaders here in Great Falls, is just what can we do to make young people want to be here? What can we do to make this a welcoming place for people of younger generations? And that's actually something I'm going to cover in our next issue of our school newspaper, is what needs to change about Great Falls for you to want to stay? Because all I hear is people ready to get out of here, which I think is natural, just as you go to college and you want to explore the world. But also, I don't hear a lot of people wanting to come back. And so I want to see what can we do to change that, because Montana is a great place, and I hate to see a bunch of people who would be wonderful leaders here so eager to take off. I would actually ask this of the audience. I'm just curious if you want to respond in the chat. So when you vote for somebody, you obviously are looking for somebody who embodies your ideals and what you want to see represented in the legislature. Would you vote for a young person or an old person? Like, who would you tend to vote for? I don't think we see a lot of young people running, simply because there aren't as many young people, as we pointed out already. But I'm just curious, like, would you be willing to vote for a young person or not, and why? I'm just curious on that. And some advice, I think, to young people is I would just say the best way to get involved is to just show up and ask questions of your elected officials. I think that these barriers that we're setting up between older and younger generations are really flimsy, if you will. They're not heavy barriers. And I think if you just make a phone call or send an email, most of these people are more than willing to just answer your questions, whether you're old or young. And so that's my advice on that topic.
Wonderful, thank you. Samantha, I know you had said that you had come and gone from Montana a bit, if I'm remembering correctly. And was part of that departure, did it have something to do with wanting to find sort of a community of people that were more, were younger, just more young people to be around?
Absolutely. I mean, I thought I wanted to leave Montana and never come back, and that just wasn't true. I lived in Hawaii and California, and though I love those places, Montana is home. However, growing up, being one of the very few African-American people in the town that I live in, it was very hard. There was no one that looked like me. So there wasn't those conversations that I needed to be having at a younger age about what it meant to be political as an African-American woman. I didn't have examples. The leadership didn't look like me. I was adopted, so my family didn't even look like me. So leaving here, I was looking for that connection with people, a younger group of friends and connections that also looks like me. Because that's the one thing, when you're African American, to share, there's not many people that I can share my experiences with that can not just understand, but can relate. And so leaving here, I really was trying to find that, and I did, and that was beautiful. However, like I said, especially this last year, I realized that, why I love this place so much. I mean, you've got the mountains and the rivers and the hiking, it's beautiful, but I want to do that work here. I want to bring that here. I want to be a voice here so that the younger generation isn't feeling like there's no representation, that there isn't an African-American woman in the community speaking out, wearing her hair natural, talking about what it means to be a person of color, So I was looking for that. I found it, but coming home, I want to create that culture here, especially here in the Flathead Valley.
Fabulous, exciting. I listen to y'all talk. I'm like, I kind of want to immediately do like a 10-year re-panel and like, where are they now? We've already come into this in multiple ways, but I want to make some space to think about it head on, the intersection of race or ethnicity and age. So nationally, the younger spectrum, the younger part of the national population is much more racially diverse, and unsurprisingly, that same part of the demographic tends to be much more concerned about racism and actively involved in dismantling it. I found one Pew Research survey from June of 2020, which showed that younger adults were 3 times as likely as those ages 30 or older to have contributed to an organization that focused on race or racial equity in the previous month, which is pretty extraordinary given the fact that, of course, the bulk of the resources are not in that demographic. And people 38 years and younger were much more likely to have attended a rally or protest, posted on social media. Those are probably a little bit more predictable, but also it's interesting that they are much more likely to have contacted an elected official to express their opinion about racism. So that honestly, I think is really hopeful in the sense that young people are so engaged, but it's also on the other side, maybe a little depressing, because that means they're also doing a lot of the work, or I shouldn't say you are doing a lot of the work. How do you see race and age intersecting in Montana, or in general, or just in your own experience beyond what we've already shared?
I'll start on that one. So even just referring back to the BLM rallies this last summer, it was a group of teenagers. I wasn't out there the first day, I was out there the second day, but it was a group of teenagers out there standing on the street corner with their signs, and I was, it was very humbling for me to see that, these young kids, these lots of high schoolers, kids that couldn't even vote, out there doing that work and standing up, having people honk, but also having people flip you off and say all those things, and then to do that, for me to stand out there, you do feel like you're on display. It is very intimidating. And, I think back to when I was in high school, and I just don't know if I would have had the guts to do what they did. I'm 28 and I was one of the older people out there, which is crazy to think about. I mean, the younger generation, I think, I don't know. I guess I believe, with social media and, just everything being televised, we have more access to information and what's going on. And so I think it's, I think, and you can post it on social media, you can get it out there, get the word out there. And I think because the younger generations more into that as well, it's easier to be a part. So I think the younger generation really is stepping up and trying to do something different. Even though I'm young, I'm just getting into this work and I'm, finding the passion and purpose in it. But I think it's definitely showing.
Yeah, when I'm reading these statistics that are talking about how much more racially diverse the country is getting, and that Montana is one of the oldest and whitest states, at least in the West, and I think definitely the whitest in terms of in the country, one of the whitest in the country. So it that worries me, honestly, for the future of the state that we all love. And I guess I want to just put this really bluntly: how do we prevent Montana from becoming a state full of nothing but old white people? Because that is not the future of the country. That is not going to serve us well, just in terms of being a place that has frankly enough people for things to function, and a healthy and diverse political discourse and citizenry. Any ideas on how we can stop that from happening? Taylor, you're unmuted, so I'm going to pick
Yeah, I think an important distinction to make is that older and white people are not the issue. It's the resistance to diversification that's the issue. It's not like a blame game, right? But I would say in Great Falls specifically, an issue that comes to mind is with the service members. We have Malmstrom Air Force Base here, which brings a lot of community members of color, men and women who are Black and other races, but who are also younger. They're usually in their early 20s. And so I think that it's important to address the racism issue that is in our community, and I'm sure it kind of goes statewide as well. There was a news story a couple months ago about this, and what I noticed in the Facebook comments were a lot of people being critical of the people who were making the complaints instead of criticizing the actions that were being done to them. And so instead of questioning the legitimacy of claims, I think it's important to just hear people out and try to learn from it. Nobody wants to be called a racist, and I don't think that that's the direction we should take at all as a younger generation, because we will just further polarize an already polarized situation. So
part of the electoral work that that we do is that we are seeing a trend as far as electoral politics move away from sort of the split ticket voter, the ones who might vote for president for one party and then, let's say, governor down ballot for another party. The last real example of that was 2016, where people voted for Trump for president and what's his name?
Bullock.
Steve Bullock was elected governor. And this last election shows that people were straight ticket voters, and that is a symptom of what's going on politically. So while I agree to some degree with Taylor, I think that it's also important to recognize the fact that there is a movement away from sort of the suburbs of some of these coastal states, more urban states, of people who may be sympathizers of white supremacy, that may sympathize with sort of the Make America Great Again type of ideology, that are moving to places like Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. I mean, Western Montana has, very deep enclaves of white supremacy out there. And so I think I would caution that we not oversimplify things, but still be able to call out white supremacy when it's there, and to act against it, obviously. But I think that from where I sit and the experience that I've seen, in the short term, it's going to get worse rather than get better. And I know that's probably not the sort of the message of enthusiasm and hope that people want to hear, but it's what the trends are showing. There was the white migration from the inner city to the suburbs, and then now that the suburbs are becoming more diversified, there's the white flight from them to places like here. And that's just the reality of what's going on. So that's where my eyes are at.
What effects does that potentially have on us as a state? And I'm not necessarily asking you in particular, Tahin, although you're welcome to chime in, but just for everyone, like what if that's true? And I think your stuff, Tahin. So if we are going to go through a period where we get even whiter and maybe even older for a while, like what's that going to do to us as in Montana?
Well, we're seeing that right now. I think with the legislative session, we're seeing voter suppression, just going crazy. We're seeing anti-trans bills being proposed. We're seeing massive budget cuts to some of the security net programs, such as Medicaid, major cuts to PHHS. And so we're seeing the effects of that even within the last 4 years of the ideology moving. I mean, we've been, I've been in the years that I've been involved with legislative sessions all the way back to, 2017 legislative session. There was that sort of trend, and Carla here in the chat is right. When you have a super majority of a certain ideology in the legislative as well as the executive branch, there is no sort of guardrail or veto guardrail or sort of goalie, to use a soccer reference. And that's what I'm predicting. And so I've had conversations with allies about how do we reach out to working class white people to make sure that we can land on something where strict appealing to people's emotions isn't enough. I think that appealing to their realities as far as their pocketbooks is another important aspect to consider. But we're already seeing the effects of more white, just generally more white.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I want to get back to the chat for a minute. I really appreciated the question you threw out, Taylor. And Sam, do you want to maybe read some of the responses there? And maybe there are some questions that we can sprinkle into our conversation here.
Yeah, the conversation in the chat is great. And thank you to everyone who's helping push that forward. Brenda just said, I hope people realize that there are a lot of older white people in the state that fear this same white flight to Montana, especially given the current political atmosphere in Helena. I've seen it and I don't like it one bit. So there's that idea that Tahin was talking about of allies too. Kim McMahon asked earlier, how are young people reacting to various states' voter restriction efforts? And you touched on that a little bit, but does anyone want to say more about the voter restrictions that are coming through?
Yeah, I can touch on that. At Ford, Montana, we're working really closely with our partners at Western Native Voice on this. Not well, everyone's very upset, especially like some of the ID bills are specifically targeting younger voters, BIPOC voters. And so like there's a voter ID bill that like would require a second form of ID, and it's like a school ID isn't allowed. So if you're a college student, I don't really know what you're supposed to do if you can't use your school ID. So that's pretty good, not good. There's another one, another bill about repealing same-day voter registration, which has been pivotal in like why Montana has pretty high voter turnout. And without same-day voter registration, our voter turnout's going to go down. It disproportionately harms, especially working people who are working during the day. And that's actually a bill that was a ballot initiative in like 2014, I think, or 2016 that voters turned down. And so I think young people are extremely terrified about all these voter suppression efforts because it's targeting them in the same ways that, we're seeing it across the country.
Thanks, Kirsten. I'm going to just throw out another question for the chat. If grabs you, great. If not, that's fine. I'm curious, who is a young politically active person who inspires you? Whether it's someone, you know, locally in your community, nationally, internationally, even, who's a younger person that you see on the political scene that really inspires you, audience? And to the panelists, I want to shift gears a little bit into this whole question about how to talk to each other and with each other and listen to each other. I feel like everybody on all sides of the political spectrum agrees that we're not doing a great job at civic dialogue in our country right now, and yet there are forums where it is happening. This is one of them. I'm curious, for our panelists, how do you think young people are being shaped by this hyper polarized political discourse? And do you think that your generation or generations are bringing a different ethos, or do you think it's more likely that they're kind of getting marinated in like, this is how it's done, and kind of maybe in a way just accepting it as like, this is what we're going to do too?
Okay, yeah, I think there's definitely kind of an awareness among a lot of young people that those things that are occurring shouldn't be, and that they're entirely ridiculous. I think that we've kind of on both sides of the aisle as young people have come to that conclusion, which I'm proud of. But there is a fair amount of polarization among young people as well. And I think something that we should talk about today is social media and the influence that that plays in the political realm. That wasn't on one of the outlined questions, but I think it ties into this question very well. You know, for example, I think the biggest social media right now is TikTok. And I don't know how many people here are really familiar with how TikTok works, but it's really fascinating. And I can tell you that the algorithm is really frightening if you understand how it works. But TikTok is able to target people, users, with the exact content that they want to see. And I think that that is a mirror image of what we see on the national political level and on Fox News and CNN. These areas that were intended to be informational and as an opportunity for people to voice their opinions become echo chambers and just further the polarization. And so I just think that's something that younger people need to be aware of. And, you know, just stopping that from becoming the next Fox News versus CNN kind of phenomenon we have across the country.
Mm-hmm. So I'm hearing you say that even though, yes, there's a concern for not doing this polarized, not listening nonsense, but at the same time, since everyone's on social media and the social media is pretty much pushing like with like, you could be having all of you and your friends who think the same way could agree very strongly that we should have better civic debate, but not actually be talking to each other, listening to each other. I'm so happy to see Samantha's back. We lost you mid-thought. Can you chime back in on this?
Yeah, sorry about that. My thing died, but I'm back. And just kind of to go off of what he was just talking about as well, you know, a lot of the things that I do with my work, it's conversation. You know, the fact of the matter is like, yes, you can sit around with your friends and like-minded individuals and continue to talk about the things that we agree on or are on the same page about, but to really to change things and to get away from that, like, again, the Fox and the CNN kind of, we're right, is to sit down with somebody who thinks differently. You know, the thing is when you can make somebody more human, when you take out, you know, I'm right or you're right, or I'm left and you're right, you know, and when we sit down and hear why people believe what they believe and share why you believe what you believe, I think a lot of times you break down those walls and those barriers to have the tough conversations. And a lot of times you learn something. I know that I've learned from all the conversations I've had. Even if it doesn't change my opinion, I learned something. And it takes away that divisiveness that sometimes we see in politics that makes us feel like we have to be one way or another, left or right, conservative or liberal. When we can break down those walls and have the conversations with the older generation or people who don't think like you, we really open up the door to create something new and different. And I think that, you know, with the polarizing, I mean, that's what that is intending to do to keep us from doing that. So when we can sit down and look somebody in the eye who might not believe exactly what we believe, but try to find some common ground, and if at the very least try to understand each other better, I think that will help us move closer to the future that I think we all want.
Sorry, another point to add, I think, to that, Samantha, is that the foundation for a good conversation is understanding how the processes work. And I think that if we have a stronger political education nationwide, I think that that'll allow for more meaningful conversation because everybody's working with the same toolbox and understanding of the tasks at hand instead of these misinformed beliefs that I think sometimes flood social media and discussions in person too. I think also as a young generation, we have the opportunity with our larger social spheres to really drive the inclusive nature of discussion. And so that's on us, I think too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to have a fruitful conversation if you're not at least living in somewhat of the same reality of facts. Like there does have to be some kind of shared understanding of some of the basic facts at hand. And so, yeah, I appreciate your point about the education piece being so huge, Taylor. I'm just going to move us along to one more of my questions, and then I'm going to open it up to more questions from the chat. So if people want to have specific questions for the panel, feel free to drop them in the chat, and then Samantha will read them out. So Kirsten brought this up when we spoke earlier that many of the leaders that have made it into our history books in our country were very young. The so-called founding fathers maybe should have been called the founding sons. They were, many of them were younger than 40 in 1776. The average age of the signers of the Declaration of Independence was 44. More than a dozen of those people were 35 years old or younger. And it's the same, it's not just in what feels like that distant history. The same with the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were both only 39 years old when they were assassinated. Medgar Evers was 37 years old. There, the list goes on and on. What does that history have to tell us today? I should have looked up the average age of a member of Congress, but it's definitely not 37 or 44. So both nationally and in Montana. So what does that history have to tell us now? Just that so many of the big important things that have happened in our country have been led by what would now be considered, the younger generations.
I think it's definitely a good reminder that young people have always been on the front lines of engagement and always leading the charge and are always going to be pushing the boundaries for what is possible. And might seem like, oh no, that's too radical of idea, that's too revolutionary, but that's how social change gets done. I think about the climate movement when the Sunrise movement came up around 2016 or 2017, not long after the Trump presidency. And one of their biggest moves was to do a sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's office, right? The leading Democrat. And here was this young climate organization sitting in the office of a leading Democrat to talk about a Green New Deal and climate solutions. And that's when AOC became really popular. There's a really iconic image of her with these other young protesters. And I think it's just showing that young people are always going to be pushing the boundaries. When I started this work in climate and conservation, I was always asked why don't young people care? Why aren't there more young people involved? Where are all the young people? Where are your friends? And part of it was well, maybe the space that we're creating isn't accessible for young people, or it's not exciting, or it's not inclusive, and they don't feel like the space involves them. But then another part of that is that young people actually do care. They show it in different ways, and it might be the same strategies and tactics, or even the same solutions that some other generations or other organizations do, but it's still just as valid. And I think it's frankly a really sad day when the youth aren't pushing for what is possible and aren't pushing for more. I think we run into big problems when that day comes.
Yeah, and it seems to me like there's a sort of a troubling trend going on where all of that energy, because the spaces inside institutions, not just political institutions, but so many institutions, are occupied by people that are even significantly older than me, and I'm no youngling, that a lot of that energy and momentum that maybe used to get funneled into like a run for Congress, or becoming the director of your nonprofit organization, although you all are giving the lie to that, but that a lot of that youthful force then ends up being like in opposition to institutions instead of coming inside of them and helping to change them and renew them. And that really worries me, because I think the institutions are only as strong as the latest generation decides to make them. And so if there's a whole bunch of people growing up that are like, yeah, it's all corrupt, there's no place for me there, then how are we going to ever make them better? And how are we going to make them reflective of how the country is changing? I don't know if any of you have that concern, or if you're seeing that starting to change, perhaps, that maybe younger people are getting invested in the institutions that govern our political life.
I think that's an important point to make, for sure. I think that this country and its institutions are set up for success if we use them right. And I think that around me, I actually do see a lot of people my age willing to use those institutions. I have a friend named Luke. He is eager to be a city planner. And, that's not something that I think a lot of kids get interested in, but I see people like him who are willing to just jump right into those really important bureaucratic jobs and that's cool. I want to tack on to Kirsten's point that it is a giant misconception that young people don't care about politics. That's not at all the case. And she's absolutely right when she says that it's just a different way of expressing it. And it's just, we're making points, and if you're willing to listen, they're there. It just might be a little bit harder to hear it if you've been, in a different narrative for so long. I also want to kind of make a clarification on a point I made earlier about kids only believing what their parents tell them. I think as we get older, we definitely challenge our parents' beliefs, and that's what we should do. We really should, no matter what age you are, you should be constantly challenging the belief set that you have, and being willing to accept criticism and grow from that. So, but yeah, I think that youth really do have opinions on issues from gun control to abortion, and that information's there. It's just a matter of finding our way of displaying it, because I think that's where the disconnect is. There's not a lack of information, it's more there's a lack of communication between the generations.
Tahin, before we go to chat questions, I'd love to hear just a little bit from you about what you're seeing in Indigenous communities in terms of, do you think that there's more young people willing to run for office, or seeing that as a valid use of their time and energy?
So one thing to make abundantly clear here is that rural tribal communities oftentimes are dealing with a lot of crisis situations that many of us in urban areas or outside reservations don't have to worry about. I mean, access to clean water, access to healthcare, access to employment, access to education. So a lot of young people who graduate from high school end up, leaving tribal nations to go and pursue their education, and many don't come back as a combination of there's no jobs back home to welcome them back home. That's not to say that there's not a sort of a cultural connection that the youth have a strong cultural connection that they would like to go back, but because of the consequences of the genocide that's still going on, that's being perpetrated by the dominant culture towards Indigenous peoples it's created an untenable situation in tribal nations where they're stuck in a quasi-political different location to the rest of, for example, the country and the state of Montana. So there aren't as many opportunities. There's a lot more roadblocks than there is anything else. And so when you see people who run for office, it's still usually the people who have the means to do it, the people who have established long-term sort of network of family members and community members who have possibly already served on tribal councils. And so that's where a lot of the representation from within, for example, a legislature is coming from, sort of older folks. But when you look at Indigenous people from urban areas and from sort of outside of some of Montana's tribal nations, you see that being a little bit younger. So thinking back on the previous makeup of our legislature, we had Barbara Bissett out of Great Falls, who was younger. We had, what's her name? Her first name is Jade. Jade Barr from Billings, who used to serve in the legislature. She's young as well, and a young Indigenous person. And of course, the gentleman who ran for state auditor, Shane Morjo, who's from CSKT, another example of a young person. And these are folks that that represented and ran and represented districts that were in urban areas. And so there is a difference to be made here between those who live in urban areas and within rural tribal nations. So the native vote isn't necessarily a monolith. It's not monolithic. Within tribal nations, there's a lot more, communities in crisis and individuals in crisis. We have, public health issues ranging from suicides to alcohol and other substance abuse, missing and murdered Indigenous women. So there's all sorts of things that are capturing the people's needs right now. And what we're seeing is that there's more of an appetite of community organizing along with electoral responsibility and participation. But a lot of it is trying to find answers within and trying to build native sovereignty. And that's where our focus, a lot of it is within tribal nations, is building that sovereignty so that these sovereign nations can create their own path forward, because no one else is going to be there for them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. So Sam Dwyer, do you want to read a few questions or comments from the chat?
Yeah, we've had some more come in, and a theme that I'm kind of seeing in these comments and questions is how to bridge the age gap and have those conversations across generations. People are asking how to be more inclusive, how to make our institutions more inclusive, or our communities. I've got a question from Madison County. Doris and Sheridan says, in Madison County, our local Democratic Party has had difficulty identifying young adults who have the time and the desire to engage in political issues. There were a few comments in the chat about campaign finance reform and some barriers to political activism and engagement. And so I think, the question is kind of, what advice would you give, or what changes can we make so that our democracy is more inclusive of young people? Yeah.
So speaking personally, and I know this is a nonpartisan panel, but I had been involved with the Democratic Central Committee here in Yellowstone County for some time, some years ago, and I felt very discouraged by it because of sort of this old guard sort of type of inability to look beyond their own nose type of mentality within the Democratic establishment. And so I think that here in Yellowstone County is symptomatic for a lot of what's going on, nationally with this particular party. I think that in any sort of political group or party, when it comes to sort of providing fundraising, and as somebody who ran for office, I was sort of, even though it was a nonpartisan election, there were the different parties were providing, some support in one shape or another for certain candidates. And it was my firsthand experience that there was an abandonment of younger people who may not have deeper connections in favor for sort of the old guard. And I think that that is so combating that bias, I think, is really important for anybody who's involved in electoral politics and is looking to, is asking themselves the question, how do we bring in younger people? I think it's significantly restructuring the body on a regular basis. And I know that that's something that is scary for these kinds of groups, these kinds of entities, to completely shake up their whole, makeup. But it's important to do that regularly and have it within bylaws to regularly sort of, get rid of the whole group. Of course, that doesn't mean, get rid of all the documents and that kind of thing, but to really put the overall good of the movement forward, rather than preserving egos or preserving status quos. So that's sort of my outlook on that question.
Thanks for sharing that. It seems really interesting and relevant that you've had personal experience with that. I know we're basically at time. I would love to hear other panelists' responses. Sam, what's the protocol here? Do we need to call it? I think we probably do, huh?
Well, let's put the survey in the chat, and I would say yes. If you need to go, we're at time. If we can take maybe 3 more minutes or so to kind of hear from one last word from each person, that would be a great way to wrap up.
Yeah, phenomenal. And maybe on this question of what we can do, like if you could wave your magic wand to make young people have more power and have the political spaces be more inclusive of young people, what would you do?
I guess it just goes back for me on this question. It's about education. Like we referenced earlier, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were 39 when they were assassinated. And in school, if we emphasize that more, if we emphasize the age more and talked about, put it into perspective that 39 isn't that old. And in 10, if you're a senior in high school, that's 10 years from now, so, and those, their careers started long before then. So I think it really is taking it back, for the younger generation specifically, it's an education thing and to inspire, people who are still in school to know that, being young is a privilege still, and you can do, you have the power to do it. So many influential people in history, we don't talk about their age, but we did focus on that part. I think it would help. Even for me specifically, if I had paid attention to more of that, I wouldn't have held myself back so much. You always think maybe when I'm older, maybe when I got to do all this stuff, and then when I'm older, but it starts now. So I think it really starts with the education. And then just stepping out of your comfort zone. If we want to build that bridge for the younger generation and the older generation, we have to, just as young people, just as much as the older generation, have to be open-minded to what they have to say. And, they have the life experience, so to be, again, to just have the conversation. I really do believe in the power of conversation. I really do believe that's where the work begins.
Yeah, I think it's twofold. I think one, there's just like structural barriers and laws that need to be changed, and like around voting and other ways of civic engagement, and just like different policies that make it more inviting for young folks to be involved in these different processes. And then I think there's a lot of the pieces that Samantha's talking about around having conversations. And to me, a lot of that is having humility. And understanding that like none of us know everything, but we know something, and like really approaching that from a space of humility and grace and compassion, I think will go a long way.
I would say that focusing on people's stories and what each person has to offer is very important. That's something that I try to do in my high school journalism, is just sharing individual perspectives, because it's the collective whole of the perspectives that makes us who we are as a society. And I just think that we should focus on tearing down some of the barriers that hold young people back. And one of those barriers is that a lot of times older people are reluctant to share the spotlight. And so I think that we should encourage older people who are in leadership roles to not necessarily step out of those leadership roles, but to allow young people to also, share in that spotlight, if you will. And then also, we should stop as a collective with labels. I think that labeling people as, too socialist or too liberal or too conservative or too fringe right is a sure way to just kind of drive our whole society into the ground. So those are my 2 cents.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. What an interesting and lively and honestly, for me, kind of hopeful panel to end on, partly because you're willing to dig in and lean into the parts that aren't hopeful and are scary and hard too, which makes it feel like when we land on things that have some forward momentum, that it's really authentic. Thank you everyone who is here today, who's come to the other panels. It's been a real honor to get to moderate this. So I will turn it back over to Humanities Montana. Thanks everyone.
And just to say it again, we're so grateful for everyone who's participated as audience members and as panelists. Thank you today to Samantha, Kirsten, Tahin, Taylor, and Amy. Thank you to Emily for live captioning to make this more accessible. I hope you enjoyed this Why It Matters program. If you've caught several of the series, if you want to go back, these are all recorded and available on our website and our YouTube channel. So please revisit. There's a lot to dig through in all of these programs and to reflect on and to move forward and to keep these conversations going. If you would like to help support future programs like this, please consider donating to Humanities Montana. We truly appreciate the support of our community when you bring the humanities into your daily life. Thank you, everyone, and good night.